And don't mind me, I was just doing some tidying up. You know, this reminds me of a really weird dream I had last night. What the?
You must play Link's Awakening.
Okay. Well, who am I to question fate?
The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, when adventure meets compression. The first Zelda game ever released on a handheld console, Link's Awakening was one of the more difficult Game Boy games to make due to how massive the console entries were. It was originally a side project created by programmer Kazuaki Morita, which he made as a test using one of the Game Boy's first development kits. Other members of Nintendo's development team ended up joining him on the project, and it began to look more and more promising. After the release of A Link to the Past, Takashi Tezuka began to lead development for a handheld Zelda game based on that prototype that was originally just going to be a port of A Link to the Past, but it ended up evolving into its own separate game. The developers had a bit more freedom for this entry, which allowed them to add elements from unrelated games while also omitting ones from earlier Zelda titles. The story was primarily written by Yoshiaki Koizuma, who helped make it much more fleshed out than previous games. The game was promoted in North America with a cross-country train competition called the Zelda Whistle Stop Tour, which allowed people to test it out before its release, which was a really cool promotion. The full game was released in 1993 on June 6th in Japan, August 6th in North America, and December 1st in Europe. It was a massive hit, selling over 3.83 million copies and helping increase sales of the Game Boy tremendously. And of course, it received universal acclaim, not as much as the console Zelda games, but still quite a bit. It would later receive an enhanced port for the Game Boy Color titled Link's Awakening DX, which was released in 1998, and it was fully remade for the Switch in 2019.
I've never played this game before. I do own the Switch remake, but I haven't played it yet, and I'm actually not going to be playing it today, since I figured it'd be better if I saved that one for another time, and instead took a look at the Game Boy Color version. Now sadly, I don't own a physical copy of the Game Boy Color version, so I'll be playing it via the Nintendo Switch Online service, and with the recent release of Tears of the Kingdom, I think it's fitting that we take a look at the first portable Zelda game to see just how far we've really come.
The game opens with Link sailing on the open seas. I think this is supposed to be the same one from A Link to the Past, but I'm not certain. Remember, the series timeline is pretty hard to follow. Link gets caught in a massive storm and washes up on a deserted island where he's found by a young girl who takes him to her house in Mabe Village. When he wakes up, she introduces herself as Marin and tells Link he's on Koholint Island. Her father, Terran, gives Link his shield back, and then he goes to the beach to find his sword. Once there, this owl appears and tells Link that monsters on the island have gone haywire because of Link's arrival. It turns out this island is home to the mysterious windfish, which is currently sleeping in a giant egg on top of a mountain. If Link wants to leave the island, he must collect 8 instruments placed inside dungeons and use them to awaken the windfish. But the monsters don't want this to happen, so they're trying to prevent him from doing so. This is easily the most drastic change for a Zelda game story we've had so far, since it throws away almost all of the series staples. There's no Hyrule, no Ganon, no Triforce, no Master Sword, there's not even Zelda. She's briefly mentioned at the start, but she doesn't appear in this game at all. Kinda weird, since she's the character the series is named after. But while it changes up the elements, the story at its core is pretty much the same thing as the first Zelda game. Collect 8 objects to reach the final dungeon. Only this time you're collecting magic instruments to leave the island instead of collecting Triforce pieces to stop Ganon. The real focus of the story, though, is its characters. Despite being a Game Boy game, this is probably the most in-depth characters we've seen in the Zelda series so far. Okay, they're not hugely complex, but they get more focus than previously. Link to the Past had a handful of important characters, but most of them weren't very interesting or memorable. Here, there's all sorts of colorful characters you meet. Marin and Terran, Madame Meow Meow, Prince Richard, Crazy Tracy, and tons more.
It's impressive they were able to add this much character into such a limited system, and that sentiment can be applied to the rest of the game too, for the most part.
Graphically speaking, the game looks pretty good for the system. Not as good as something like Kirby, but still solid. And much like other Game Boy games, the music is pretty limited, but it's still nice to listen to. Now, the actual game is the traditional Zelda formula established in Zelda 1 and A Link to the Past, and it strikes a perfect balance between them in terms of complexity. Like the previous game, you can move diagonally, Link swings his sword instead of stabbing it, thank God, and you can still use the spin attack. Once again, your goal is to travel around and complete various dungeons, which each contain items and boss fights. In terms of items, we obviously have the sword and shield, but the shield works differently from before. Instead of being built in, it's an equipable item that you have to hold in order to use, and you can only block by holding the button. This might sound like a downgrade, but I actually prefer this method since you know for a fact you're using the shield. Sure, it's one extra item you have to deal with, but I'm fine with that. For returning items, we have the magic powder, the power bracelet, bombs, the Pegasus boots, the ocarina, which is titled properly this time, flippers, the hookshot, the bow, and the boomerang. The only ones that act really differently are the ocarina, which instead of being used to teleport you, is used to play one of 3 songs that you unlock throughout the game, and the magic powder, which can burn torches and and enemies. There's no magic meter in this game, so stuff like the elemental rods and the magic cape have been removed, but it does bring back the magic rod from Zelda 1, which works the same as it did then. There's also no bottles, so you can't store potions and fairies in this game. Instead, you have to go to this witch named Crazy Tracy, who will sell you medicine that automatically revives you upon dying, but you can only use it once before you have to go back and buy more. For new items, we have the Rock's Feather, which actually lets you jump, the shovel that lets you dig up things, and that's it.
At least that's all of the main items. This game actually has a handful of power-ups.
Sometimes when you kill enemies, they'll drop either a piece of power, which doubles the damage you do, or a guardian acorn, which halves the damage you take. They wear off if you take a couple of hits, but they can be pretty useful when you get them. Like before, the dungeons have keys, maps, and compasses, but there's also these stone beaks you can find. Scattered throughout the dungeons are these owl statues, and if you talk to them with a beak, they can give you some hints, which range from actually helpful to completely useless. There's also these foam booths you can find in the overworld, which serve as the replacement for the fortune teller, and it's about as useful. If you saw my review of the other Zelda games, I'm sure you're wondering if this game is as cryptic, and the answer is kinda. Okay, it's definitely not as cryptic as the first two games, and I wouldn't say there's any majorly stupid moments like the ice rod or the hook shining over the river like in Link to the Past, but this game can be pretty confusing. The main reason being you can't just go to each dungeon in the game. They all require finding a special key in order to open them, and the keys are often hidden in completely different locations than the actual dungeons. So if you spent eons searching for something and found the dungeon before finding the key, you just completely wasted your time. Now, in terms of frustration, this is definitely the easiest Zelda game so far. There are a couple of moments that can be irritating, but there's nothing that drives me up the wall like previously, which is good for a reason I'll get into later. This was also the first Zelda game to introduce a massive collecting-based side quest that takes up most of the game. Sure, older games had the heart pieces, and this one does too, but it goes a step further. In the main town, there's this crane game you can play to grab a Yoshi doll. Yes, Yoshi, like from Mario. If you grab it and give it to this baby, its mother will give you a ribbon, and thus begins the trading quest. Throughout the entire island, you'll find people who want random objects, and by giving them what they want, they'll give you something else. So you're constantly giving people random stuff, and while it's mostly optional, at least half of it is mandatory.
Thankfully, the random objects are stored separately in your inventory rather than taking up an additional item slot. This is important because we have now reached the absolute worst thing about this game: its pacing.
Link's Awakening is attempting to give an authentic Zelda experience by having almost as much complexity as A Link to the Past, but on a far more limited system. And I can give it a lot of respect for that, but there is one issue with the Game Boy that is physically impossible to overcome. These. The Game Boy only has 2 face buttons, meaning you only have 2 buttons to use in the game. By default, the A button lets you talk to people, but aside from that, both buttons are used purely for items. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with this, since Zelda 1 was on the NES, which also only had 2 buttons. And you would think it's worse there, since the A button was always mapped to the sword, while here you can map any item to either button. But the problem is that since this game is trying to be more like A Link to the Past, there are more items than there were in Zelda 1, and you can only use 2 at a time. And you are constantly, and I mean constantly pausing the game to switch out whatever item you currently have equipped, only to use it once or twice and then immediately switch back to the one you just had. Now, you could argue A Link to the Past had it worse, since you could only hold 1 extra item, but that was just for things like your weapons. You still had a dedicated button for the sword, talking to people, picking things up, and other context-sensitive stuff. Here, everything has to be mapped to a button in order to use it. In the last game, you didn't need to select the power bracelet in order to pick things up, but here, you do. And you need to select the Pegasus boots in order to use them, when last time you just had to hold the A button. The only exception is the flippers, which just let you swim as soon as you enter water. And if these can be context sensitive, I don't know why the power bracelet couldn't be too. And you can only use the face buttons because start brings up the menu and select brings up the map screen.
And to save the game, you literally have to hit 4 buttons at once. Yeah, it's dumb, and really picky too.
But even without the constant item switching, this game has a real issue with text boxes. The text itself moves really slowly, and they pop up continuously. If you talk to someone, there's no way to cancel it. If you try and pick up a rock without the power bracelet, you get a text box. It happens if you touch one of these crystals that you can only break by dashing through them with the Pegasus boots, and every single time you get an acorn or power piece, you get an identical text box. I know what they do, can you please shut up? I genuinely get hesitant to grab these things because I just do not want to sit through another frickin' text box. And this also applies to the stuff you find in chests. The rupees aren't as bad since they at least give you the value, but every time you find a key, it tells you what it does. And so does the dungeon map. And so does the compass, which also tells you about this new feature where it chimes every time you enter a room with a key in it. Yes, I'm well aware of that feature. You don't need to tell me every single time I find one when they are in every dungeon in the game. I know what these things do. Can we please just get things moving already?
I know Zelda's not exactly a fast-paced game, but when you're constantly getting interrupted every 10 seconds, it gets really annoying, especially in the later game when you have a lot more items to deal with.
Now aside from that, most of the dungeons are pretty solid. They're not that much crazier than the ones from previous games, although some can be a little complicated. The only really interesting thing is that if you go downstairs, the game becomes a side-scroller. This was kind of done in Zelda 1, but here the perspective is a lot more obvious. The one thing about the dungeons I find really annoying is that the enemies respawn. In previous games, enemies you already killed would stay dead until you died and went back to the entrance. But here, if you leave for just a minute and then come back, it'll be like you never killed them. And since a lot of the doors only open when you kill all of the enemies, you have to kill them all over again, which just adds to this game's already slow pacing. But thankfully, there is a way to partially get around this. In addition to the boss, which is referred to as a nightmare, every dungeon in this game also has a mini-boss you have to fight. If you kill them, it not only spawns a fairy that fully restores your health, which is nice, but it also sets up a warp point. It transports you back and forth between wherever it spawns and the entrance, which really helps cut down on backtracking.
But probably the strangest thing about this game is it weirdly has some cameos of characters from other games.
I already mentioned the Yoshi doll, but this game just straight up uses characters from other games. For enemies, we've got Goombas, Cheep Cheeps, and Piranha Plants from Mario, and an evil version of Kirby, and there's even a freaking Ching Chomp that's kept as a pet by this woman named Madame Meow Meow. But despite those, it does keep a decent amount of earlier Zelda enemies like Moblins, Likes, and of course, Cuckoos. Alright, you little bastard, I'm gonna get you this time. Come here, you little— oh no, not again! Take it, Swarm! Ah!
I guess the war continues.
The overworld has a handful of pretty interesting locations. You can go fishing in Mabe Village, there's a river riding minigame, the crane game I mentioned earlier, there's of course the standard shop where you can buy things, but it's actually possible to steal something from it. But if you do so, Link's name will be changed to Thief for the rest of the game, and if you go back inside, the shopkeeper will electrocute you to death. The DX version even adds a photography studio. Once you find it, you can get your picture taken in various locations around the island, and these are adorable. And you can even print them if you're one of the 7 people who owns a Game Boy printer. Now on to the actual dungeons. After getting the sword, you have to travel to the mysterious woods. This stupid raccoon will transport you so you can't pass unless you find a toadstool and bring it to a witch. She turns it into the magic powder, and when you sprinkle it on the raccoon, he goes insane and is revealed to be Terran, who was transformed after eating a toadstool. Then you grab this key and head to level 1, the Tail Cave. It's a pretty standard first dungeon. You get the Rock's Feather, and the mini-boss is this small pink thing that rolls a spiked cylinder you have to jump over. Meanwhile, the nightmare is— No! Not again! Not again! Get away from me, you worthless piece of— No. Okay, that was easy. Upon beating Moldorm, you get your first instrument, the Full Moon Cello. Go back to the village and find out that Bow Wow, Lady Meow Meow's pet chain chomp, has been kidnapped by moblins. Go to their hideout, and once you kill them all, you grab Bow Wow's chain and have him eat a bunch of enemies in the Gopongo Swamp. This clears a path to level 2, the Bottle Grotto. Another pretty uninteresting dungeon. You get the Power Bracelet, and the mini-boss is this giant Cyclops that throws bombs and you. The nightmare is the genie. He pops out of his bottle and throws fire. When he goes back inside, you have to hit it with the sword, pick it up, and throw it. Once it breaks, you're free to slash away as he teleports. Kill him and grab the conch horn, then bring Bow Wow back to Madame Meow Meow, who, rewards you. Then stop by the store to pick up a shovel and some bombs. Travel south to this villa where you meet Prince Richard, and he tells you he used to live in Canelet Castle, but he was thrown out by his servants. So you have to go there and collect 5 golden leaves. But before you can do so, you have to start the trading quest. And now I think it's time we go over that. Lightning round! You give the Yoshi doll to the baby for a ribbon, give the ribbon to a Ching Chomp puppy for some dog food, give the dog food to a gator for some bananas, give the bananas to a monkey who builds a bridge and leaves a stick, give the stick to Marin so he knocks over a beehive letting you grab a honeycomb, give the honeycomb to a bear chef in exchange for a pineapple, give the pineapple to a guy in the mountains in exchange for a hibiscus, give the hibiscus to this goat girl and she'll ask you to deliver a letter, give the letter to this old guy named Mr. Right and he'll give you a broom, give the broom to an old woman for a fishing hook, give the fishing hook to a fisherman and he'll catch a necklace, give the necklace back to this mermaid who lost it and she'll let you take one of her scales, and place the mermaid scale in the mermaid statue, which will open up a secret cave, letting you get this magnifying glass. Then go to this cave on the beach and trade the shovel for the boomerang.
Nice and simple.
Honestly, it's all worth it because the boomerang might be the best weapon in the game. It's strong, ranged, doesn't rely on ammo, and can kill enemies that are otherwise invincible. Anyway, back to the main story. The trading quest is mandatory up until the monkeys because they build you a bridge. You have to storm the castle and collect the leaves. Bring them back to Richard, and he won't just give you the key though, that would be too easy. You have to go through his basement and do this really annoying hole puzzle to get it, then go all the way back and use the key, go around in a loop, and then you finally reach level 3, the Key Cavern. Why did that have to be so complicated? As the name implies, this dungeon has a lot of keys. It also has a lot of these switches that move the blocks up and down. It gets pretty annoying. Plus, this dungeon introduces the mechanic where you have to poke the wall with your sword to see if you can destroy it with bombs. Why is this here? Couldn't you just put the cracks in the walls? This is much easier to miss. This is where you get the Pegasus boots, and the mini-boss is these two snake things. You have to place bombs in front of them so they eat them, kind of like the Dodongo from Zelda 1. The nightmare is this thing called the slime eye. You have to slash it so it slides apart, and when it's narrow, charge with the Pegasus boots to split it in two. Then slash away while the blobs jump around, only to be rewarded with the Sea Lily's bell. Now, the owl tells you need to go to the Yarna Desert, but that's not actually our next stop. No. You have to go back to the Mabe village and enter this house. Here you take a nap and get transported to this mini-dungeon where you get the ocarina. Then speak with Marin outside and she'll sing for you, which teaches you your first song. Then go down to the animal village, which is populated entirely by anthropomorphic animals, only to find a giant sleeping walrus blocking your path like a freaking Snorlax. He'll only wake up if he hears Marin's song, so you just need to play it on your ocarina, right? Nope, he's a hipster who can only enjoy the real thing. She's not in the village anymore, though. She's on the beach. Here, she talks with Link about what lies beyond the island, and wishes she was a seagull so she could fly away as far as she can. Then you take her to the walrus so it wakes up. She goes to sing in the animal village, and you head into the desert. Kill this thing in the quicksand, grab the key, head north to the mountains, use the key in front of them to shut off a waterfall, then walk all the way up the mountains and jump down to reach level 4, the Angler's Tunnel. It's the game's water dungeon, the one thing everyone loves. The only really interesting thing is this part where you have to match the pattern on these tiles. You get the flippers, and the mini-boss is this giant blob that can only be damaged from the back. And the nightmare, Angler, is the easiest boss in Zelda history. It's in the water, and you just have to slash it along with the fish that swim by. That's it. He literally doesn't attack you at all. Grab the surf harp, and when you leave, swim east to find a cave with this giant sunfish in it that teaches you a song that warps you back to this lake. Really would have enjoyed getting that earlier. Then this ghost starts following you, and you have to take it to its house by the bay, and then back to its grave in the cemetery.
Well, that was pointless.
Now you have to go for a swim and dive under this rock to find level 5, the Catfish's Maw. And this is where the dungeons start getting a lot longer, since there are so many rooms and it's not always easy to backtrack. This giant skeleton pops up in certain rooms, and you have to fight him 3 times in order to get the hookshot. This dungeon also has the worst mini-boss in the entire game. It's these 2 spiders that move back and forth and can only be damaged when they open their eye to shoot a fireball. Problem is, they can go up to an entire minute without opening their eye, so this fight takes forever. The nightmare is the slime eel, which is pretty annoying. It swings its tail and pops out of these 4 holes. You have to yank it out with the hookshot and then slash. It wouldn't be as bad if it wasn't for the stupid tail. Find the wind marimba, and now I can finally afford the bow in the shop. Christ, that thing is expensive. You have to go back east and find 2 shrines. The first one is in the south, guarded by these statues that come to life when you touch them. And inside, you find this giant one that's really easy with the bow. You get a key, but also find some ruins. According to this, the entire island and all of its inhabitants are all part of the windfish's dream, and if the fish wakes up, Koholint Island will cease to exist. The owl tells us no one is certain if this is true, but I need to leave, so if a bunch of dream people drown, I'm okay with that. Head north to level 6, the Face Shrine, and this dungeon never ends. It is insanely confusing to navigate, and it's filled with whiz robes which can only be killed with bombs or arrows, but they constantly disappear, so it's very hard to hit them. I spent almost an hour on this place. The mini-boss is this little creature that throws a giant steel ball at you, which you have to pick up and then throw back. So it's the world's deadliest game of catch. You get an upgrade for the power bracelet that lets you pick up these giant statues, and the nightmare is Face-Odd. Very clever. It's literally a face built into the floor, and you have to block these tiles and avoid the sporadic holes while placing bombs on his face to damage him. It's not hard, but if you run out of bombs, you're screwed. Before croaking, he says that everything on the island will vanish if the windfish wakes up, and you grab the coral triangle. Once again, you don't have to immediately go where you're told, as you have to go to this weird sign maze and meet a group of frogs led by Wart from Mario 2. They teach you a new song, then you go back to Mabe Village and push this wind veil so you can go underground and play the song to revive a dead rooster.
Seriously, am I just an idiot, or does the game flat out not tell you about this? Because I genuinely had no idea this was a thing until I looked it up on the internet. Would it kill them to at least say I need a rooster?
You then take the rooster back up the mountain and use it to fly over these gaps for the key. I normally would want to slaughter you, but I guess we can work out a truce. Then go all the way to the top of the mountain and use the key to open level 7, the Eagle's Tower. This dungeon is even bigger than the last one, and you have to use the steel ball to knock down 4 pillars to make the upper floor fall. It's a cool concept, but navigating this place gets really confusing, especially since you have to use the holes to fall to previous floors. You get the mirror shield, which lets you block certain things, and the mini-boss is pathetic. It's this guy called the Grim Creeper who just sinks a bunch of birds on you that die in one hit. Then you reach the top of the tower and find him again, only this time he's riding on a giant eagle. He flies around, and you have to slash him with the sword. The only really annoying part is when he tries to blow you off while shooting feathers at you, so you're gonna need the shield. Grab the Organ of Evening Calm, and then find Marin on a nearby bridge, so you have to use the hookshot to save her. Now we can reach the final final dungeon, which doesn't require a key, but there's one thing I haven't mentioned yet. There's a bunch of seashells scattered throughout the island. If you collect enough of them and then take them back to the mansion, you get a sword upgrade that makes you stronger and gives you back the sword beam. Oh, how I missed you. There's 26 shells total, but you only need 20 to get the upgrade. Now we head to the final dungeon, Turtle Rock. This is easily the worst dungeon in the game. It's filled with lava, and you can only cross it by pushing these giant stamps to create a path. Problem is, it resets every time you leave, and a lot of the time it's impossible to get back without using the Sunfish song to warp back to the entrance. Oh, yeah, I forgot to mention you can do that. On top of that, this dungeon is absolutely enormous, and you have rematches with most of the previous mini-bosses that respawn, with the worst one being the bomb snakes, since you have to throw bombs at them because the chest spawns up here. The actual mini-boss is this little boxer guy that can send you flying back to the entrance. When you beat him, you get the magic rod, and you have to use its fire energy to melt these ice blocks. Then the nightmare is this fire monster called Hothead. No, not that one. And to beat him, you have to use the magic rod. Ooh, wait a minute. You kill the fire monster by shooting fire at it? Really? Although now that I think about it, if someone shot me with a mound of flesh, it would probably hurt too. You then get the final instrument, the Thunder Drum.
Now we have all the instruments, but the DX version actually adds one extra dungeon.
You unlock it by reading this book in the library and then pushing these graves in the correct order. Since this version was released for the Game Boy Color, it's based entirely on color puzzles, like flipping switches and pushing enemies in the correct holes. It's fairly short, but neat. The mini-boss is this blob you have to use the magic powder on and then slash. And the actual boss is this guy whose head changes colors as you slice him while he spits fireballs. It says you need to be careful when his head turns red, but that is a complete lie because that means he's about to die. When you kill him, you meet a great fairy who gives you the choice of increasing your attack or defense. And personally, I chose attack. Now we can finally wake the windfish. Go to its egg and play Marin's song to open it. Then go inside and follow the path told in this book to reach the final boss, the Nightmare. Yeah, it's just called the Nightmare. That's like having the head chef of a restaurant just be called the chef. That name applies to everyone. What makes you so special? The Nightmare claims that he and his minions were born to take over the world and keep the windfish asleep, so we need to destroy them for good by waking him up. This leads to a pretty mixed final boss. He's a shadow that shapeshifts into different forms. Each one has a different weakness, and the hardest part is just figuring out what actually hurts him. The first one is a blob that bounces around, and you have to sprinkle the magic powder on him. The second one is a replica of Aghanim from A Link to the Past, and you have to deflect these orbs. The third one is a replica of Moldorm, and again, just hit the tail. The fourth one is a replica of Ganon, and you have to avoid these birds, and he can only be hurt when he throws his spear. But the only things that hurt him are a charge from the Pegasus boots and the spin attack. Then the fifth one is a sphere that dies in one spin attack. But the final phase, known as Deathel, is just downright awful. He grows these two long tentacles that are really hard to avoid, and they do so much damage. He follows you around the room and can only be hurt when he opens his eye. Then you have to shoot him with an arrow or throw the boomerang. Problem is, he rarely opens his eye, and he takes about 15 hits to kill. And if you die, you have to start this whole fight all over again. I hated this so much. When he finally goes down, he tells you their world will vanish as a ladder appears. You climb it, and then use the instruments to finally awaken the windfish. He thanks you and tells you that Koholint Island is in fact a dream, but dreams can't last forever. The entire island and everyone on it then disappears as Link is rocketed to the sky. He awakens on part of his raft in the middle of the ocean as the windfish jumps through the air, and Link begins to drift home. And that's the end of the game. Sort of. This game actually has an alternate ending if you beat it without dying a single time, and this is why I'm grateful the game is fairly easy for the most part. After the credits, we see that Marin transformed into a seagull and is able to fulfill her wish of flying as far as she can. Well, at least one person made it out alive.
Game conquered. Link's Awakening is a good game, but it is really held back by its hardware. I can respect it for being so ambitious with such a limited system, but I think it bit off more than it could chew, especially with the constant item switching. Combine that with all the text boxes and the later dungeons going on for really long, and you have a game that is a lot more irritating than it needs to be. I know for a fact the remake fixes at least one of those issues, but that's a topic for another time. I did enjoy most of Link's Awakening, but I think it's a one-and-done game for me, at least the original version anyway. But it did teach me a valuable lesson about always appreciating your dreams, because you never know what's real and what isn't. Isn't that right, Senor Street Show? Wait, what?
So that's why you don't eat Burger King at 3 in the morning.